At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, more than 150 Soviet-built T-34 tanks crashed across the 38th parallel. North Korea's surprise attack, Operation Pakpung, shattered every defense in its path. Seoul fell in 3 days. The United Nations, which had never waged a single war, now faced the most desperate counterstrike of the Cold War. How close it all came to failure starts at that border. Before sunrise on June 25, 1950, the silence along the 38th parallel shattered. Soviet-built T-34-85 tanks, their engines roaring, led columns of North Korean infantry through thick morning fog. Artillery shells pounded the South's border posts at Ongjin Peninsula by 4:40 a.m., cutting communications and leaving defenders scrambling. The code name for this onslaught was Operation Pakpung, meaning storm. In less than 3 hours, North Korean armored spearheads had driven 3 to 5 kilometers into South Korean territory across every major crossing. Along the east coast, naval infantry landed south of Gangneung at 5:25 a.m., while partisans secured Ulsan the same day. Republic of Korea troops, lacking anti-tank weapons and heavy artillery, found themselves outmatched by Soviet armor and massed firepower. By nightfall, towns like Ongjin, Kaesong, and Sinyuri had fallen. The scale and speed of the attack left little time for warning or resistance. The border, once tense but static, had become a corridor for invasion, and the crisis was now in motion. Kim Il-sung traveled to Moscow, seeking the green light for war. In April 1950, Stalin agreed, but only if China would not object. Mao Zedong gave his approval on May 14th, after careful review of Stalin's telegram. With both powers on board, the invasion plan moved from ambition to blueprint. Soviet Lieutenant General Vasilyev and North Korean Chief of Staff Kang Kan finalized operational details by the end of May. Over the previous year, North Korea had quietly built up its forces, stockpiling Soviet tanks, artillery, and munitions. Advisors from Moscow trained KPA units, but stopped short of direct combat roles. By midnight on June 24th, North Korean troops stood ready along the 38th parallel, supplied and positioned for a coordinated assault. The careful orchestration behind Operation Pakpung made the attack possible, blending North Korean initiative with the material backing of its communist allies. The path from secret negotiations to tanks rolling south was paved by diplomacy, logistics, and a shared willingness to test the post-war order. Within hours of the initial barrage, North Korean forces pressed their advantage across every front. By dawn, 2 battalions of naval infantry, reinforced by 1,000 partisans, landed south of Gangneung at 5:25 in the morning, seizing the coastal town and pushing inland. Simultaneously, 600 partisans overwhelmed Ulsan, securing a foothold along the eastern shoreline. Central columns surged 12 kilometers toward Chuncheon, cutting through scattered resistance. The Republic of Korea defensive lines, already battered by tank-led assaults and artillery, began to fragment. Town after town fell in rapid succession. By the end of the first day, Ongjin, Kaesong, and Sinyuri were lost. North Korean units advanced up to 8 kilometers down the east coast, while the main thrust closed in on Seoul. The capital, barely 3 days from the border, became the next target. On June 28th, just 72 hours after the invasion began, North Korean troops entered Seoul. The speed and coordination of Operation Pakpung left little room for organized defense, setting off alarms far beyond the peninsula and forcing the world to confront a rapidly escalating crisis. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session as news of the invasion reached New York. Within hours, delegates faced a stark choice: act or watch the Korean Peninsula collapse into wider war. On June 25, 1950, the Council adopted Resolution 82 by a vote of 9-0. The resolution condemned North Korea's assault as a breach of the peace and demanded an immediate halt to hostilities and withdrawal of North Korean forces to the 38th parallel. Yugoslavia abstained. The Soviet Union's seat remained empty. Moscow was boycotting the Council in protest over China's representation. This absence removed the threat of a Soviet veto, clearing a rare path for decisive action. The following day, with North Korean troops pressing deeper into the south, the Council passed Resolution 83. The vote again stood at 9 in favor, none opposed, with Yugoslavia abstaining and the Soviet chair still vacant. Resolution 83 called on UN member states to provide military assistance to the Republic of Korea, shifting the crisis from condemnation to collective action. The legal foundation for intervention was now set. In a matter of 48 hours, the United Nations had authorized the use of force to repel the invasion, an extraordinary consensus forged in the shadow of Cold War divisions and enabled by a single absent delegate. President Harry S. Truman faced the news of Seoul's fall with urgency. On June 27, 1950, he issued a direct order. United States air and naval forces would provide cover and support to South Korean troops. The decision was swift and public, rooted in the need to back up the United Nations call for military assistance. Truman made clear that American ships and planes would act immediately, but ground troops were not yet committed. The United States Navy began moving its 7th Fleet into position, and Air Force squadrons prepared for missions over the peninsula. As the North Korean advance continued, the United Nations Security Council took the next step. On July 7, 1950, Resolution 84 called for the creation of a unified command under United States leadership. President Truman responded by naming General Douglas MacArthur as Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command. MacArthur, already stationed in Tokyo as the head of United States Far East Command, now held authority over all United Nations and South Korean forces in the field. This chain of command, established in less than 2 weeks, gave the international response a single, decisive leader. The world watched as American resolve and United Nations consensus turned into coordinated action, setting the stage for a high-risk counteroffensive against the North Korean onslaught. With the fall of Seoul and North Korean columns driving relentlessly south, the city of Busan became the last foothold for the battered Republic of Korea and the gathering United Nations forces. Hundreds of thousands of civilians streamed into the shrinking perimeter, fleeing the violence that had swallowed town after town. Families crowded onto roads, carrying what little they could as the front lines drew ever closer. The port at Busan offered the only reliable entry point for reinforcements and supplies. Every ton of ammunition, food, and fuel had to arrive by sea. The rail yards and docks worked around the clock, unloading shipments from American and British freighters. Soldiers dug in along a defensive arc, knowing that if the perimeter broke, there would be nowhere left to retreat. For many, the difference between survival and defeat depended on whether a convoy made it through. The pressure on both the defenders and the refugees was crushing. As hope narrowed to a thin coastal strip, the world wondered if it would hold. At Incheon, the sea itself became an obstacle. Twice a day, tides surged nearly 32 feet, exposing slick mudflats and narrowing the landing window to just a few hours. Naval planners warned that ships could run aground or be stranded, but General MacArthur insisted on the element of surprise. On September 15, 1950, as the morning tide peaked at 6:29 a.m., waves of United States Marines stormed ashore at Wolmedo Island under cover of naval bombardment. By midday, they had secured the island and pressed on to Incheon's harbor, scaling seawalls with ladders and fighting through fortified streets. The gamble paid off. North Korean defenders, convinced the harbor was impossible to assault, were caught off guard. Within 4 days, United Nations forces recaptured Seoul, cutting North Korean supply lines and forcing a retreat from the south. The Incheon landing transformed a desperate defense into a sudden counter-offensive, breaking the siege at Pusan and reversing the momentum of the war. The Korean peninsula remains divided and tense, its scars still shaping global security. As rival powers test boundaries and alliances endure, the lessons of 1950 echo in every new crisis. History here isn't remote, it's a warning. The next move, as always, carries consequences that reach far beyond these borders.